A sealed envelope, marked only with the royal insignia and the words "to my son." It arrived without ceremony, yet its timing was anything but random. Inside was a truth King Charles had hidden from the world, and from his heir. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The delivery itself was almost too quiet. A discreet knock at the door during what was supposed to be a routine debriefing. The aide who handed it over said nothing. No explanation. No visible urgency. And yet, the moment William saw the handwriting, his breath caught in his chest. It was unmistakable, his father's penmanship, tight and sharp, dated several months ago. Why now? Why wasn't this delivered sooner? Or later? The timing was suspicious. Not just personally, but politically. With rumors of internal fractures already swirling through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, this letter threatened to widen the cracks into canyons. What followed in the minutes after was not grief. It was dread. William didn't even finish the meeting. He excused himself without explanation and vanished into the royal apartments. No security. No press. Just a future king folding in on himself with a letter he never wanted to read. For hours, no one saw him. The public had no idea. But behind palace walls, aides were already whispering. Something had changed. Something had been set in motion. And no one, not even Catherine, knew what. When she did find him, he wasn't the same. She asked what was wrong. He shook his head. He tried to smile. But she saw it in his eyes. Something had been taken from him, and no crown could ever give it back. Catherine had watched her husband face endless pressure. But this was different. He wasn't just shaken. He was haunted. She pressed him again, and this time he looked at her, truly looked, and all he said was, "It's from him." And that's when the shift began. Cancelled appearances. Private meetings. A notable absence at a state reception. The tabloids speculated illness, exhaustion, even marital strain. But the truth was darker than any of those headlines could imagine. The envelope had shattered something sacred. Not just between father and son, but between the institution and its illusion of unity. Meanwhile, the palace remained quiet. No statement. No mention of any letter. And yet, high-ranking staff were already probing communications logs, tracking internal delivery schedules, and quietly trying to trace who authorized the envelope's release. Because according to official royal archives, no such letter was ever logged, stamped, or prepared. It simply appeared. And that terrified them. Because if King Charles had meant those words for a time after his passing, someone had just accelerated history. And the consequences, emotional, political, dynastic, would be seismic. For William, the crown had always felt like an eventual burden. But now, it was a trap sprung early, loaded with secrets, and delivered by the one man he had always hoped to trust. But what lay inside the letter would not only unravel the future, it would expose a plan Charles had buried deep in silence. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, a revelation, and perhaps most devastating of all, a final royal command. As William read, his hands trembled, because within these pages, his father rewrote history and the future. Charles had never been one for dramatic declarations. He'd learned early that power didn't require noise, it required restraint. But now, with ink pressed to paper in sharp, deliberate strokes, he peeled back the armor he'd worn for decades. The letter began not as a farewell, but as an unraveling. He spoke of his health, not in clinical terms, but in haunted admissions. Episodes, fatigue, forgotten meetings, fear. He confessed he'd hidden these signs even from those closest to him, not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear that stepping back would fracture what little stability the monarchy had left. And then came the revelation that hit like a thunderclap. Charles had considered abdication. More than once. Quietly. Strategically. But every time he drew close to that line, something or someone pulled him back. The pressures of government. The influence of advisors. And, most strikingly, the presence of Camilla. He wrote that he and the Queen Consort had made a pact, one that bound them together not just in marriage, but in legacy. They had decided that his reign, however short, must be used to cement their version of the monarchy. One that didn't just survive, but erased the ghosts of the past. And yet, within those pages, the mask slipped. Charles admitted he'd miscalculated. That in silencing the past, he had also silenced truth. That in pushing for a sanitized, dignified future, he had alienated the very soul of the crown. And then came the moment William could hardly believe. His father wrote of Diana not in formal tone, not as royal history but as a wound never healed. A choice never justified. A shadow that no amount of titles or time could erase. And he admitted, at last, that much of what William endured, what Harry rebelled against, began with that silence. But it was the final paragraphs that chilled William to his core. Charles wrote not as a father, but as a king. He tasked his son with protecting the crown by any means necessary. He warned of storms to come, factions within the palace, whispers that would try to divide. And in what read almost like prophecy, he urged William not to wait for ceremony or permission. He asked him to lead. Not when the nation asked, but when the institution began to rot from within. That moment, Charles believed, was closer than anyone realized. Even more shocking was the timeline. A reference to a plan drawn up in secret, suggesting a transition of power long before the public would ever be told. Hints of legal mechanisms, private counsel, and the possibility of a shadow regency. It wasn't just succession, it was survival, disguised as smooth continuity. And as the prince stared at the words etched in ink and heartbreak, he realized this wasn't just a goodbye, it was a burden being passed, ready or not. He was unraveling, and she saw it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had endured the pressure of titles, but never like this. This was different. This was war behind palace walls, and now, her husband was its first casualty. The hallway was quiet when she found him, sitting in the dim flicker of a lamp, the letter open but unreadable on the table. His eyes weren't red, but hollow, as if something had been pulled out of him and couldn't be replaced. For a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, he slid the pages toward her. No words, just the weight of trust passed across the table. Catherine read slowly, methodically, but her hands didn't shake. They clenched. The message wasn't just personal, it was political. It wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. This was the kind of secret that didn't just shake a family. It could destroy an institution. She didn't cry. She didn't whisper comforts. Her voice was steady, sharpened by years of knowing how to survive pressure behind velvet curtains. Her first words were clear. We cannot let this disappear into palace silence, because she knew the pattern. Letters like these vanished. They were rewritten, reinterpreted, filed into oblivion. But not this time. Not with William at the center. Not when the crown was on the edge of an invisible transition. Her mind raced. Who could they trust? Certainly not every aide. Certainly not those closest to Charles or Camilla. The line between loyalty and control had blurred long ago. But one name came with certainty: Anne. The Princess Royal had always stood with steel in her spine and clarity in her convictions. If anyone could hold this letter with both hands and not flinch, it was her. Catherine urged William to make the call, to bring Anne in before whispers turned into weapons. But she didn't stop there. Catherine began making calls of her own. Not to the press, not to politicians, but to the quiet, trusted few. A legal contact from university. A longtime family aide with no love for palace politics. A private secretary who'd once resigned over principle. This wasn't gossip. This was protection. A shield built quietly before the storm broke wide. She was organizing not just for crisis but for war. The kind that didn't take place in headlines, but in silence. In locked rooms. In planned leaks. In buried files. And all the while, William watched her not as a prince watching his princess, but as a man seeing the only person holding him upright. For a moment, the future didn't feel quite so impossible. Until they noticed it. The pause in a call. The flicker on a screen. The feeling in their bones. Something had shifted. And though Catherine didn't speak it aloud, she already knew. But even as Catherine rallied around her husband, she knew. They were already being watched. Hidden deep in royal archives and alluded to in Charles' final letter was a pact forged, not out of love, but out of necessity. Camilla was never meant to rule, but she was never going to surrender either. Anne's instincts had been humming since the letter surfaced. She'd seen too many backdoor decisions, too many quiet handshakes behind locked doors. So when she quietly requested access to archived communications from her brother's private desk, she wasn't just curious, she was certain. What she found was far more chilling than even she expected. Sealed under layers of classification was a memorandum initialed, dated, and disturbingly clear. It wasn't a will nor a directive. It was an agreement between Charles and Camilla. Crafted not long after his coronation, the document wasn't about marriage. It was about power. The text outlined that regardless of any abdication or shift in public duty, Camilla would retain influence over transitional matters and legacy perception. In plainer terms, she would remain behind the curtain, orchestrating how history saw the monarchy and who would rise next. The tone wasn't bitter. It was calculated. Charles, weary of institutional fractures and media warfare, saw Camilla not only as a companion, but as a stabilizing agent. In his mind, her continued presence offered continuity, familiarity. But for Anne, it was a red flag. More troubling still, the memorandum referenced succession planning in cryptic language. One phrase in particular stood out: all public-facing announcements regarding abdication or transition will be coordinated with Her Majesty the Queen Consort's office. It was subtle, but enough to raise questions. Who really had the final word? William, the Crown, or Camilla? Whispers from trusted staff revealed that Charles had originally planned to begin the transition process over a year ago, until, mysteriously, plans were delayed. Anne pieced it together. Camilla had reportedly raised concerns about public trust, media volatility, and institutional stability. But was it caution or control? The delay aligned too perfectly with the language of the agreement. Determined to verify the document's reach, Anne had it scanned for metadata. That's when the real alarm sounded. A duplicate had been uploaded to a restricted royal server, a server recently accessed by an external device not linked to palace protocol. The logs were anonymized, but the timing aligned with one particular day, the day William received the letter. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew. And someone wanted that agreement buried or used. Anne didn't speak of it publicly. Not yet. But her resolve hardened. This wasn't about royal duty anymore. It was about untangling a web where personal allegiance, historical rewriting, and raw ambition blurred into a single, dangerous truth. And with that discovery, a race began not for the throne, but for the truth behind who really controlled it. For the first time since Diana's funeral, William vanished. No appearances. No statements. Just silence. But it wasn't grief that consumed him, it was betrayal. And behind the scenes, decisions were already being made in his name. The prince who had for so long been the embodiment of duty had gone dark. No cameras, no press releases, no sightings outside the gates. One day he was there grim but steady. The next, he was simply gone. While the palace issued vague comments about private family time, no one truly believed it. Whispers spread like wildfire. Something had broken inside William. And this time, it wasn't just personal, it was constitutional. Journalists scrambled for any angle. Paparazzi camped outside Kensington. Commentators speculated on exhaustion, emotional instability, and even abdication in disguise. The headlines grew bolder by the hour. Yet inside the walls of power, something else was happening, something quieter, and far more dangerous. Camilla, Queen Consort, stepped into the vacuum with calculated grace. More public appearances, more charity visits, carefully curated statements about continuity and stability. The optics were unmistakable. The monarchy was still functioning, and Camilla wanted the world to see who was holding it up. Royal aides, meanwhile, weren't waiting for direction. Drafts of contingency messages began circulating, statements that could be deployed in the event of long-term withdrawal or leadership transition. Behind every document was an implicit assumption that William might not return in time. Or worse, might not return at all. The letter from Charles had cracked something open that could not be sealed back shut. And as Camilla's presence expanded, so too did the question: was this a quiet coup under the guise of duty? Amidst the chaos, Catherine acted. Unwavering and quietly strategic. she made an unannounced visit to Queen Elizabeth II's private chapel. No statement was issued, no cameras were allowed. But the press noticed, and the moment the image leaked, Catherine, head bowed in that sacred space, it was enough to shake the nation. Speculation turned feverish. Was she mourning a death? Or a legacy? What no one knew at that point was how deep the palace divisions had grown. Inside conversations had begun to shift. Senior courtiers spoke in hushed tones about an unprecedented path. Retired advisors were consulted. Lines were being drawn. And amid it all, one phrase emerged again and again in private emails, overheard calls, and behind-the-scenes documents: "Is William stepping away?" But as the palace spun its narrative, a final unexpected voice emerged and everything changed. When Princess Anne walks into a crisis, she doesn't panic, she cuts through it. And this time, her words weren't veiled or softened. They were a direct strike at everything her brother had built and let decay. In a palace where discretion is tradition and silence often speaks louder than words, Anne shattered the royal code with chilling precision. Her statement, delivered during a rare joint military commemoration, left the crowd frozen and the press scrambling. She expressed grave concern over what she called the prioritization of personal interests over the enduring duty owed to the people. No names were mentioned, but no one needed them. The implication was as sharp as it was undeniable. This was a rebuke of her brother's legacy, and the forces now threatening to unravel it. It wasn't just the tone, it was the timing. Anne's words came days after William's disappearance and Camilla's quiet ascent into center stage. And though her speech was public, its origin was anything but spontaneous. Leaks began surfacing of a private letter exchanged between Anne and Charles years earlier, in which she had warned him that unchecked loyalty to one person could erode loyalty to the crown. That person, many now believe, was Camilla. And now, the consequences were no longer hypothetical, they were at the palace gates. What made Anne's intervention even more explosive was the target she avoided naming directly. But sources close to the royal household revealed she had grown increasingly distrustful of Camilla's inner circle, especially those appointed in the final months of Charles's active reign. These advisors, rumored to have influenced key decisions around succession and access, were described by insiders as kingmakers without crowns. Anne's message was clear. The monarchy wasn't meant to be shaped by private ambition, and Camilla, by allowing her circle to overstep, had invited a storm. The reaction was instant and polarizing. Public support for Anne surged in certain quarters, with phrases like the true royal backbone trending across headlines. Others, however, questioned the wisdom of airing family rifts so openly. The palace, backed into a corner, issued a vague statement about robust internal discourse and continued unity. But few believed it. The damage had been done. The Queen Consort's camp was furious and rattled. And just when the narrative seemed ready to fracture further, William made a move no one anticipated. Though brief and tightly scripted, he released a statement expressing full alignment with Anne's sentiment about duty, stability, and transparency. He didn't name his father. He didn't mention Camilla. But his silence on them was its own thunderclap. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't the one the palace had been quietly propping up. But while the kingdom debated loyalty and lineage, the crown's weight was already shifting toward an unexpected reckoning. The monarchy stood at a cliff's edge. And as the wind howled over Westminster, a choice loomed. Continue the old guard's secrets or rise under the heirs. Bloodied but honest. The future couldn't hold both. In the shadow of chaos, a subtle but undeniable shift began to unfold. William and Catherine, no longer just figures of ceremonial grace, started receiving quiet, unofficial briefings from government advisors. These weren't courtesy updates. They were tactical warnings. Conversations behind oak-paneled doors had taken a new tone. Stability, the advisors said, was drifting. The crown's moral authority was being tested. And the people, once content with pageantry, were now demanding purpose. These briefings didn't name Camilla, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew the temperature, and everyone knew its source. Camilla, meanwhile, refused to yield. She doubled down on presence, more visits, more televised engagements, more carefully staged messages of continuity. Her argument was simple. The crown needs calm, not change. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Every move she made seemed increasingly out of sync with the undercurrent sweeping through the public. Her insistence on maintaining Charles's vision was seen by many as an effort to protect her legacy, not the monarchy's. And when palace insiders hinted that she was unprepared to step aside prematurely, the backlash was instant and fierce. Then came the photo. Leaked without warning, it showed Charles' final letter to William, the one marked "To my son." Though only a portion was visible, the message was unmistakable. In his own hand, Charles had written, "The burden must pass, and you must protect what I could not." The press seized it. Analysts, columnists, and even former officials called it a seismic shift. The debate was no longer about timelines or technicalities, it was about legitimacy. About who truly held the moral right to lead. In the days that followed, public opinion began pivoting with startling speed. Polls shifted, social feeds flooded with the same refrain: William and Catherine represented the monarchy people wanted, not just the one they were given. Their silence, once mistaken for hesitation, was now read as strategy, dignified restraint in a palace cracking under contradictions. Every time they were spotted in public walking into a church, exiting a briefing, eyes followed. Headlines exploded. Inside the palace, legal teams worked through the night. Archives were combed, communications secured. The goal wasn't transparency, it was containment. If more letters existed, if more agreements lay buried in vaults or drives, they had to be found and fast. Not for justice, for control. Because the story was slipping. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. And the next chapter would no longer be shaped by those who had ruled, but by those who had endured. But as dawn broke over the palace, the world braced for what would be announced next and who would speak. He stood alone before the cameras. No throne, no crown. Just a son who had lost his father, and a prince now burdened with a nation. And with a trembling breath, William began to speak not for the palace, but for the people. There was no royal fanfare, no velvet backdrop or ancient symbols of monarchy. Only a solemn address, carried live across every major network and streamed by millions around the world. William's voice cracked only once, but that single moment said more than rehearsed words ever could. With unwavering resolve, he confirmed what many had speculated and others had feared. The letter was real. Written by his father in his final months, it had outlined a plan and intention for the crown to pass not through ceremony, but through conscience. Charles had seen the writing on the wall long before the public did. In the letter, William explained, the late monarch had expressed grave concern for the monarchy's future. He admitted that his reign had come at a cost not only to the institution, but to the family. William paused, breathing through the heaviness, and then delivered the words that echoed across generations. My father did not want the crown to survive through silence. He wanted it to endure through truth. With that, William shifted the monarchy's center of gravity. He vowed a new era, one of transparency, accountability, and emotional clarity. He didn't promise perfection. Instead, he offered something more dangerous: honesty. And beside him, as always, stood Catherine. Calm, resolute, and now unmistakably queen in waiting. He made it clear she would be at his side, not as a consort, but as a true partner. A co-leader of a royal house no longer content to hide behind tradition. He thanked Anne. Without naming the battles she fought, he made it clear that her courage had not gone unnoticed. There are those who held the line, he said, when the line was nearly lost. It was the closest he came to naming the internal war that had torn through the palace walls. But for those who knew, the message rang loud and clear. Anne had protected the crown's soul, and for that, history would not forget her. The United Kingdom held its breath and then exhaled. Across the country, the response was instantaneous. Crowds gathered outside palaces and cathedrals, not in protest, but in prayer. For the first time in years, the monarchy felt human again. Not polished, not perfect, but painfully real. Flags were raised not just in honor, but in hope. And yet, even as the winds of change swept through the kingdom, not all corners of the palace shared in the relief. In the deepest wing of Buckingham, behind closed doors and locked halls, one chamber remained untouched. Its door bore the crest of a man now gone. The initials were unmistakable, Krar, and whatever lay inside had yet to be revealed. There was no crown on her head, No ceremony, no procession. But as Catherine stepped alone into the Queen's study, the world saw it clearly. This was no consort. This was the future of the monarchy. In the wake of televised reckoning and palace unrest, all eyes turned not to the throne but to the woman standing just behind it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had weathered whispers, scandals, and heartbreak. But today, she walked with something deeper than resilience. She walked with quiet command. A single photo, released without fanfare, showed her entering the chamber once used by Queen Elizabeth II to plan state engagements. The caption was brief, but the message was thunderous. Something had shifted. While others fought for relevance, Catherine radiated purpose. There were no handlers in view, no anxious glances behind. And within minutes, aides began murmuring a new phrase. Not officially. Not yet, but it was enough to catch fire. Her Majesty in preparation. Not a title bestowed, but one earned through fire. She was no longer the woman behind the man. She was becoming the anchor of the institution itself. Inside the room, surrounded by relics of a bygone reign, Catherine chose reflection over rhetoric. Where others might have summoned press conferences or speeches, she reached for pen and paper. Not to respond to tabloids, nor to issue declarations, but to write to the people. Not through a filter, not through a palace-approved script. Just her thoughts. Honest, unvarnished, human. Those closest to her noted something striking. Her attire bore subtle echoes of Diana, a nod not of mimicry, but memory. A silent tribute to the woman who once walked a similar line between crown and compassion. Yet Catherine was forging her own path. One not dependent on legacy, but forged from the lessons it left behind. The image that would come to define this moment wasn't one of opulence. It was of stillness. Catherine seated at the Queen's desk, head bowed, words pouring onto parchment. No headlines, no flash, just a woman, a future queen, quietly accepting the weight of a fractured crown and preparing to hold it not in triumph, but in trust. Because in the end, it wasn't the crown that made a sovereign, it was how they carried it when it broke them first. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.